Elijah Carter had never been one to shy away from a challenge. The decision to leave Chicago and move to Willow Creek was not one he took lightly, but after years of teaching in crowded city schools, he yearned for a fresh start. He had heard about the small, predominantly white town through a job posting that had gone unfilled for years. Willow Creek High School was searching for a history teacher, and though he was warned about the town's insular nature, Elijah saw the position as an opportunity to make a difference. As he drove into town, the sight of its tidy streets and picket-fenced houses gave him hope. Willow Creek was a place that seemed stuck in time, its charm undeniable, but its homogeneity glaring. When he pulled up to the school, a red brick building with ivy creeping up its sides, he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was his new beginning. The first day of school brought with it the usual jitters, but Elijah's passion for teaching propelled him forward. As he stepped into his first class, a room full of students turned to stare. The room fell silent, and the weight of their gazes pressed down on him. "Good morning," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I'm Mr. Carter, your new history teacher. I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you as we explore history together." Some students nodded politely, while others exchanged glances and whispered among themselves. Among the students was Michael Turner, a senior who sat in the back row, arms crossed. His piercing blue eyes were fixed on Elijah, his expression unreadable but tense. "Where are you from, Mr. Carter?" Michael asked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the entire class. "I'm originally from Chicago," Elijah replied, meeting Michael's gaze. "But I believe history isn't about where we're from. It's about understanding where we've been and where we're going." Michael smirked, leaning back in his chair. Elijah continued the lesson, choosing to focus on the students who seemed genuinely interested. Yet he couldn't ignore the undercurrent of suspicion and discomfort that filled the room. As the day ended, Elijah sat alone in his classroom, reflecting on the subtle tension he had felt. He knew earning the trust and respect of his students would take time, but he was determined. After all, education was about breaking barriers, and Elijah had no intention of backing down. The first week at Willow Creek High School passed uneventfully, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The students' behavior, though mostly polite, carried an edge of resistance. It wasn't overt hostility, but the subtle signs were unmistakable. One morning, as Elijah prepared for class, he noticed something scrawled on the chalkboard in jagged letters. "Go back to where you came from." The words were like a slap to the face, but he quickly erased them before the students arrived. He knew he couldn't let the incident derail him. When he reported the message to the principal, Mrs. Anderson, her response was disheartening. "Oh, Mr. Carter, it's probably just a harmless prank," she said, avoiding his eyes. "Don't let it bother you. Kids can be immature." "But this isn't just immaturity," Elijah argued. "It's targeted harassment. How can I teach effectively if I'm not being taken seriously?" Mrs. Anderson sighed. "I understand your concern, but let's not overreact. It's important to pick your battles in a small town like this." Her dismissive tone left Elijah feeling isolated. He returned to his classroom, resolved to handle the situation on his own. But the incidents didn't stop. Students began deliberately mispronouncing his name, snickering during his lessons, and leaving anonymous notes on his desk with veiled insults. Despite the hostility, Elijah poured himself into his work. He crafted lessons designed to challenge his students' perspectives, using history to spark critical thinking. Some students, like Sarah, a quiet sophomore who sat in the front row, seemed to respond positively. She often stayed after class to ask questions or share her thoughts on the material. "Mr. Carter, I really like the way you teach," she said one afternoon. "You make history feel real." Her words gave Elijah a glimmer of hope. He knew he couldn't let the actions of a few deter him from reaching those who were willing to learn. But as the days turned into weeks, the subtle signs of racism grew harder to ignore, and Elijah began to wonder how much longer he could endure. By the time October rolled around, the hostility had shifted from subtle to overt. Michael Turner, who had remained a quiet but looming presence in Elijah's class, began openly challenging his authority. He interrupted lessons with sarcastic comments, questioned Elijah's qualifications, and made snide remarks about the curriculum. "Why do we have to learn about this?" Michael asked one day during a lesson on the civil rights movement. It's not like it's relevant anymore. Elijah paused, his gaze steady. Understanding history helps us understand ourselves. The civil rights movement isn't just about the past. It's about the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. Michael scoffed, and a few other students chuckled. Elijah felt the weight of their dismissal, but he refused to let it show. One afternoon, as Elijah walked to his car, he stopped in his tracks. Spray painted across the side of his vehicle were the words "leave" and a racial slur. His stomach churned as he stared at the hateful message. He reported the vandalism to the local police, but their response was dishearteningly familiar. "Probably just teenagers messing around," the officer said, his tone indifferent. "We'll keep an eye out, but there's not much we can do." The lack of support left Elijah feeling vulnerable and exposed. That night, as he scrubbed the paint off his car, he couldn't help but question his decision to move to Willow Creek. But deep down, he knew leaving wasn't an option. He was determined to stand his ground, no matter how difficult it became. The next day, Elijah returned to school with a renewed sense of purpose. He began journaling his experiences, documenting every incident as evidence. He knew he couldn't fight the prejudice alone, but he hoped that by persevering, he could inspire others to see beyond their biases. Elijah's resilience was tested daily, but he refused to let the hatred define him. Instead, he focused on the small victories, the students who stayed after class to ask questions, the lessons that sparked genuine curiosity, and the hope that change, however slow, was still possible. Elijah Carter's days in Willow Creek were not getting any easier. If anything, the atmosphere around him grew heavier with each passing week. One night, just as he was settling down with a cup of tea and the stack of essays he had promised to grade, there was a loud knock at his front door. It startled him so much that he spilled his tea all over the papers. His heart thudded in his chest as he got up to check who it was. When he opened the door, no one was there. The street was empty, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows. But as he looked down, he saw a small package sitting on his doorstep. Confused and uneasy, he picked it up and brought it inside. He placed it on the kitchen counter, staring at it for a moment before cautiously opening it. Inside, he found a dead rat and a note. The note was written in messy, angry handwriting, and it read, "You're not welcome here." Elijah's hands trembled as he held the note. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He sat down, trying to calm himself, but the fear was overwhelming. Who would do something like this? Was it one of his students? Someone in the community? His mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. He called the police, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. When the officers arrived, they examined the package and the note. One of them, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked at Elijah and said, "It's probably just kids playing a prank. Don't take it too seriously." "A prank?" Elijah repeated, his voice rising. "This isn't a prank. This is a threat. Someone wants me to feel unsafe in my own home." The officer sighed. "We'll make a note of it, but there's not much we can do without evidence. Let us know if anything else happens." As they left, Elijah felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He realized that if anything was going to change, he would have to protect himself. That night, he ordered security cameras online and started locking all his doors and windows, even during the day. He also began documenting everything that happened, writing down every detail in a journal. The fear didn't leave him, but neither did his resolve. "They won't scare me away," he whispered to himself. "I didn't come here to give up." Despite the threats, Elijah continued to show up at school every day. He taught his lessons with the same passion and dedication, refusing to let the fear seep into his work. And while the hate from some people in town was loud and clear, there were small moments of kindness that kept him going. Sarah, his quiet student, stayed after class one day to help him organize his papers. "I'm sorry some people are mean to you, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "You're a good teacher. I'm glad you're here." Her words brought tears to Elijah's eyes. He managed a smile and said, "Thank you, Sarah. That means more to me than you know." The little acts of kindness, like Sarah's words, were like tiny rays of sunlight breaking through dark clouds. They reminded Elijah why he had come to Willow Creek in the first place, to make a difference, no matter how hard it was. He held on to those moments, using them as fuel to keep moving forward, even when the path seemed impossibly difficult. The days following the threat were some of the hardest Elijah had ever faced. Each morning, he woke up with a knot in his stomach, wondering what new challenge the day would bring. But even in the darkness, there were small glimmers of light that gave him strength. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk grading papers, Sarah walked into his classroom. She was carrying a stack of books and a shy smile on her face. "Mr. Carter, do you need any help?" she asked. Elijah looked up, surprised. "Help? With what?" "Anything," Sarah said, setting the books down. "I just thought you might need someone to organize these, or I don't know, just help." Elijah smiled. "That's very kind of you, Sarah. Thank you." As they worked together, Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Sarah's kindness was a reminder that not everyone in Willow Creek wanted him to fail. She stayed after class nearly every day, asking questions about history and sharing her thoughts on the lessons. "You make history feel alive," she said one day. "It's like I can see the people you're talking about. It's not just dates and names anymore." Her words brought a lump to Elijah's throat. "Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot to me." The history club Elijah had started also began to grow. At first, it was just Sarah and Daniel, a quiet but curious junior who loved learning about the past. But over time, more students joined. They met after school to discuss historical events, watch documentaries, and even plan field trips to nearby historical sites. One day, Daniel approached Elijah with an idea. "Mr. Carter, what if we did a project about the civil rights movement? We could make posters and put them up around the school. Maybe it would help people understand why it's important." Elijah's heart swelled with pride. "That's a wonderful idea, Daniel. Let's do it." The students threw themselves into the project with enthusiasm, researching stories of courage and resilience from the civil rights era. They created posters with quotes from Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and other leaders. They even included lesser-known figures like Claudette Colvin and Bayard Rustin to show the breadth of the movement. When the posters went up around the school, Elijah noticed a change in some of the students. There were still those who sneered and muttered under their breath, but others stopped to read the quotes and ask questions. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. One afternoon, as Elijah walked through the hallway, he overheard a group of students talking. "Did you see that poster about the bus boycott?" one of them said. "I didn't know it lasted that long. That's crazy." "Yeah," another student replied. "It's kind of cool, though. They didn't give up." Elijah smiled to himself. It was moments like these that made all the struggles worth it. The small sparks of understanding and curiosity were proof that his work was making a difference. But the path was still far from easy. Michael Turner continued to challenge him at every turn, and the hostility from certain members of the community remained palpable. One evening, as Elijah was leaving the school, he found a note taped to his car. It was scrawled in the same messy handwriting as the threat he had received at home. It read, "You'll never belong here." Elijah took a deep breath, crumpling the note in his hand. He refused to let the hatred win. Instead, he focused on the moments of kindness and progress. Sarah, Daniel, and the other students who believed in him were his anchor, reminding him why he had come to Willow Creek in the first place. "One step at a time," he whispered to himself as he drove home that night. One step at a time. One evening, as he made his way to his car, his bag heavy with lesson plans and essays he had stayed late to prepare. He was only a few steps away from his vehicle when he heard the sound, footsteps behind him. Before he could turn, he was shoved forward, his bag falling to the ground as he hit the pavement hard. He gasped, pain shooting through his hands and knees. A shadow loomed over him, then another and another. "Thought we told you to leave," a voice hissed. It was muffled, masked, but the venom was unmistakable. The first kick landed in his side, knocking the air out of his lungs. Then came another and another. He tried to shield himself, curling into a ball, but the blows kept coming. His ribs, his back, his legs. "You don't belong here," another voice spat. Elijah clenched his teeth, refusing to cry out. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the assault stopped. He heard their footsteps retreat, their laughter echoing in the cold night air. When he was sure they were gone, Elijah pushed himself up, every movement sending waves of pain through his body. His hands were scraped and bleeding, his ribs throbbing with every breath. Slowly, he reached for his bag and car keys, his hands trembling. As he climbed into his car, he caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror, bruised, bloodied, but alive. He sat there for a long moment, trying to steady his breathing, before starting the engine and driving home. Near the morning after the attack, Elijah's physical pain was matched only by the emotional weight of what had happened. The police, predictably, had been dismissive when he filed the report. "Probably just some teenagers," the officer had said, his tone indifferent. "We'll keep an eye out." Elijah had wanted to scream, to demand that they take it seriously, but he knew it would be pointless. Their words were as hollow as the apology they'd muttered before sending him on his way. He called his sister Maya that evening. Her voice, warm and steady, was a lifeline. "Elijah, you don't have to stay there," she said after he recounted the attack. "You've done more than enough. Just come home." "I can't, Maya," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "If I leave now, they win. And what kind of example would that set for my students? For Sarah? For Daniel?" Maya sighed. "You can't fight this alone." "I'm not alone," he said softly. Despite the attack, Elijah showed up at school the next morning, his bruises visible, but his resolve unshaken. He refused to let fear keep him from doing the work he loved. When he stepped into his classroom, the usual chatter fell silent as his students noticed his injuries. He placed his bag on the desk and turned to face them, his voice calm but firm. "I'm sure you've noticed the bruises," he began. "I was attacked last night, and while I could stand here and talk about fear or anger, I'd rather talk about something else. Courage." He paused, letting the words sink in. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you are afraid. And that's something we can all learn from history. As he spoke, the room grew quieter, the weight of his words pressing on them. Later that day, Sarah and Daniel visited him during lunch, their concern evident. "We want to do something," Daniel said, his voice steady. Elijah looked up from his desk, surprised. "What do you mean?" "To show them that we're not okay with what happened to you," Sarah explained. "That we're with you." Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. "That means a lot to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want you putting yourselves in danger." "We're not afraid," Daniel replied. "And even if we are, we're going to do what's right." The days following the attack were some of the most challenging Elijah had faced in his life. The physical pain lingered, but it was the emotional toll that weighed heaviest on him. Each step into the school felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Yet as he looked at the faces of Sarah, Daniel, and the growing number of students who supported him, he knew he couldn't give up. Word of the attack spread quickly through Willow Creek High. Though the administration remained eerily silent, whispers of shock and disgust circulated among the students. Some openly expressed their support, while others remained indifferent, or worse, seemed to revel in the cruelty of what had happened. But there was a shift, small but undeniable. It started with Sarah and Daniel, who began organizing a meeting of like-minded students after school. They called it the History Makers Club, inspired by Elijah's lessons on the civil rights movement. The goal was simple: to promote understanding and unity within the school and the wider community. At first, Elijah was hesitant. He worried about their safety, knowing how deeply entrenched the town's prejudices were. But Sarah and Daniel were adamant. "We've learned from you, Mr. Carter," Sarah said one afternoon. "History isn't made by people who stay silent. It's made by those who stand up, even when it's hard." Moved by their determination, Elijah agreed to help guide them, though he made it clear that the students would lead the charge. The first meeting drew a small but diverse group of students, including a few surprising faces. Students who had previously kept their distance from Elijah's class, but were now curious about the club's mission. "We're here because we want things to change," Daniel began, standing at the front of the room. "We've all seen what's been happening, and it's not okay. This club is about showing that hate doesn't define us. We're better than that." The students brainstormed ideas for projects and events that could promote their message. They decided to organize a unity walk through Willow Creek, inviting the entire town to join. It would be a peaceful demonstration of solidarity, with students carrying signs featuring messages of hope, quotes from historical figures, and their own words about the importance of acceptance and understanding. As plans for the Unity Walk took shape, Resistance from the community became apparent. Flyers advertising the event were torn down almost as quickly as they were put up. Anonymous social media posts mocked the effort, calling it pointless and divisive. Elijah knew the students felt disheartened, but he reminded them of a lesson he had taught early in the semester. True change is never easy. It's messy, uncomfortable, and often slow, but every step forward matters. The night before the Unity Walk, Elijah stayed late at school, helping the students finalize their signs and prepare for the event. As they worked, laughter and camaraderie filled the room, a stark contrast to the hostility that had surrounded them just weeks before. "Mr. Carter," Sarah said as she carefully painted the words, "Hate has no home here," on her poster. "Do you think this will actually make a difference?" Elijah looked at her, his eyes filled with pride. "Every act of kindness, every stand against hate, makes a difference. It might not change the whole world, but it can change someone's world. And that's where it starts." The morning of the Unity Walk dawned cold and overcast, but the students' spirits were bright. Slowly, people began to gather in front of the school, where the walk would begin. Elijah was stunned to see not just students, but also a handful of teachers, parents, and even a few community members who had heard about the event. Sarah and Daniel led the group, their signs held high. As they marched through the town, chanting messages of unity and equality, more people joined. Some were hesitant at first, watching from their porches or shop fronts, but the sight of students so passionately advocating for change was hard to ignore. Elijah walked near the back, a mixture of pride and apprehension filling his chest. He couldn't help but notice Michael Turner standing on the sidewalk, his arms crossed, watching the procession with a scowl. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Elijah thought he saw something flicker in Michael's expression. Uncertainty, perhaps, or even shame, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. As the march reached its endpoint, a park in the center of town, Sarah stepped forward to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew stronger with every word. "We're here today to say that hate doesn't define Willow Creek," she said, her voice carrying through the crowd. "We're here to show that this town can be better, that we can be better. Change starts with us." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, Elijah felt a genuine sense of hope. The Unity Walk wasn't a cure-all. It wouldn't erase the deep-seated prejudices of the town overnight. But it was a beginning, a step forward in a journey that would require resilience, courage, and the determination to keep fighting for what was right. That evening, as Elijah sat in his small home, he opened his journal and began to write, "Today I saw the power of young people who refuse to let hate win. They reminded me why I'm here, why this fight is worth every bruise and every sleepless night. Change is slow, but it's happening one step at a time." As he closed the journal, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, and that was a hope for the better days.